y'all recognize this precocious teenager and her mother? That is Etta James at about 14 years old, walking away from juvenile detention with her mama, Dorothy Hawkins. Let's talk about it. Yes, honey, this is Etta James skipping off to freedom with a smile on her face after spending a night in juvenile hall. When Etta James was a teenager, around about 14 years old, she used to run with a girl gang who just, did things that wayward teen girls do, getting into fights and trouble with little girls, making out with little boys, just all kinds of silliness. Well, according to rumor, the way that Etta James got pinched in this particular instance is that she ended up getting into a fight with a little girl that she was jealous of, and her girl gang essentially beat this little girl up. This landed all of the teenagers in juvenile hall. Apparently, Etta and her friends lied on the little girl that they assaulted, saying, oh, she called us the N-word, as a way of escaping freedom, basically blaming this incident on being racially motivated, and they got away with it. This picture of Etta and her mama were taken when the two of them were coming away from juvenile hall. If you're wondering why Etta's mama is smiling happily into the sunset, skipping away with her daughter from juvenile hall and not much more upset, well, that's because Dorothy had Jamesetta when she herself was only 14 years old, leaving her with a foster family as a teenage girl to go right back running the streets as she had been before Etta was born. So during the first half of Etta's life, she spent time being shuffled between her grandparents' house on Sunday and the kind foster family that her mother left her with her mom really only breezing in and out of her life to just kind of make sure that Etta was alive, but not doing any actual parenting, to the point where Etta referred to her own mother as the mystery lady. It wasn't until after Etta's beloved foster mother died that she even went to go stay with Dorothy, and when she did, the parenting skills were less than stellar. Dorothy lied and said that an older mechanic by the name of Al Mitchell was actually the father of Etta, leading him to go to jail and her to go to reform school. When they came back to court for the judge to take a look at their case, he took one look at that light-skinned baby and said, whose damn white baby is that? And he promptly threw that case out of court. So by the time Etta was 14 and went to go live with her mother, her mom treated her more like a little sister than a daughter, playing cruel pranks on her, like pretending to be unalived, knowing that Etta had recently lost her beloved foster mother. When Etta told her that that wasn't funny, she then went off on Etta for daring to point out the obvious. I mean, this was a woman who was neglectful at best and emotionally abusive at worst. With a neglectful mother who was in a state of arrested development herself, it's no wonder that Etta James had such a troubled teenage life, and it's really fortunate that she had her talent to carry her through, because if she hadn't, she probably would have ended up a bum like her mom. Which, it just begs the question though, what kind of upbringing did Dorothy Hawkins have for her to turn out the way she did? Because that woman was, from what little bit that I could glean on her, an absolute dumpster fire of a person. I think what makes this even more tragic is that this picture of Etta and her mom walking away from juvenile court is one of the only pictures that I can even find of her and her mother. That's crazy. But yes, that is the story of how Etta James narrowly escaped a life of delinquency and became the Etta James that we all know and love, because it certainly was by no help from this woman right here. Since my last video, a few of you guys wanted to know more about Etta James's mother, Dorothy Hawkins. So I figured I'd do a part 2 on Etta James's mother and her overall mysterious parentage. Sometime in the 1930s, Dorothy Hawkins' mother passed away and Dorothy went to live with her older sister, Etta's aunt Cosette. Cosette was 10 years older than Dorothy and working as a madam at the time, and she did not want to be the caretaker for her little sister. It was one thing to be in that environment as a grown woman in that line of work, and back in those days, there weren't that many options available to black women to earn a decent living. But it was another thing entirely for a teenage girl to be in that environment, so it's clear that Dorothy wasn't going into the healthiest living arrangement. So between being a teenager, grappling with the passing of her mother, and now being thrust into this strange and unfit living situation with an unwilling guardian at that, it's no wonder that Dorothy found herself in trouble at school. By all accounts, Dorothy was definitely a wayward teen. She was hanging out with older men, and by age 14, Dorothy would end up getting pregnant. A mechanic by the name of Al Anderson would be charged by the local authorities for statutory rape of Dorothy. Dorothy was then pulled out of school and placed in reform school where she remained until giving birth to Etta in 1938. They also tied this little girl's tubes against her will, I guess to prevent any more teenage pregnancies, but child, that's probably the route that this country is taking anyway, is forcibly tying teenage girls as tubes. After that, Etta was promptly placed in the care of her Aunt Cosette and her aunt's husband, James, and the couple became her legal guardians until Dorothy was released from reform school 6 months later, wherein Etta was promptly placed back in Dorothy's care. Now, of course, we know that Dorothy wasn't ready to be a parent, and so the teenage girl would give her daughter up to her elderly landlords, Lula and Jesse Rogers, to be raised, while Dorothy went and lived her life. According to Etta, her mother was a beautiful, vivacious, voluptuous mystery woman whom she only ever saw in passing. Dorothy probably would come through just to make sure that Etta was, at least alive and maybe pay the rent, but that was about it. Apparently, Dorothy thought just showing up was enough to count as her parenting, and so she would briefly glance in Etta's direction before promptly heading off to the bathroom where she would primp and get ready to go out for the night. Etta would admire her mother getting ready in the mirror, but that was the extent of their interactions. That is until Etta got a little older. Closer to her teen years, Dorothy would begin to pick Etta up and bring Etta with her on her excursions, but this wasn't some sort of social bonding experience. What Dorothy would do is take Etta to a hotel room that she had gotten for herself and then promptly leave Etta in the room all night, sometimes a couple of nights in a row with no food and no supervision, to the point that Etta would be hungry at nights, starving by the time her mother got back. This all stopped when Lula found out what was going on and made sure that Etta never had to endure that again. Eventually, after the passing of Etta's adopted mother, Dorothy came to pick Etta up and take her in, claiming that she didn't trust Etta alone with Jesse, her adopted father. Okay, I'm going to give Etta's mother a little bit of credit here, just a smidge, because maybe in her own misguided way, she may have been trying to protect her daughter. Seeing that she herself was taken advantage of by grown men as a teenage girl, maybe she felt that Etta would fall to a similar fate. It seems like she was already trying to kind of be in the process of getting full custody of Etta when she came into her teens anyway. So maybe in her own roundabout, twisted way, this was her way of trying to care for her daughter. But that didn't mean that Dorothy was not ready to be a mother. Dorothy, being the immature, underprepared woman that she was, this was not an easy transition for either one of them. First of all, Dorothy didn't even have a place for them to stay, and so Etta had to briefly live with an uncle until Dorothy was able to get a room for the two of them. In one instance, Etta and her mother got into a violent physical altercation where her mother tried to stab her. It was after this incident that Etta began running the streets. And yes, Etta would still come home at night, but times were tense between the mother and daughter. When Etta would question her mother about the identity of her father, Dorothy would quickly change the subject, no matter how stealthily Etta would try to broach the topic. And I will give Dorothy all of my sympathy here because all of her behavior, including the avoidance of talking about the father of Etta, points to Dorothy having been raped. This was clearly something traumatic, or at least uncomfortable, that Dorothy did not want to revisit. One evening, however, Dorothy would call Etta into the living room, and when Etta came in, Dorothy pointed to the TV and told her, "That man is your father." The man in question was famous pool shark Minnesota Fats. This story would later be substantiated by the former actor Willie Best, for whom the teenage Dorothy was a groupie. Dorothy used to hang around their group, and because men back then were open predators instead of just barely concealed predators, they welcomed the teenage girl into their fold. And so Dorothy was preyed upon by this grown-ass man. Eventually, Etta would track down Minnesota Fats, her alleged father, whose real name was Rudolph Wanderone, visiting him and confronting him about his relationship with her mother. He admitted to hanging out with Willie Best back in the day, but made a point of interrupting her before she could ask about Dorothy, saying, "But that's all I remember." Whatever happened between Dorothy and Minnesota Fats, it was clear that neither party wanted to acknowledge it. Fats' wife stated after his passing that he couldn't have been Etta's father because he had struggled with prostate issues his whole life and was therefore unable to bear children. But if you ask me, I don't care what nobody says, that fat man was that girl's daddy.